All right, we're going to be talking about Dragon Age The Veilguard one more time. Going to talk about the numbers and where things stand, and also get into the Steam reviews. Now, before I had said that I thought there was something fishy going on with those Steam reviews, I think I understand what's going on now, and I think that they are accurate to the state of the game. And I'll get into that in a moment, but before I get into all of that, gameplay today is Mirthwood. It still has a 10% launch discount, so if you're seeing this in time, you can take advantage of that, and it's got a free demo. I'll put a link in the description for you guys to check that out, and I'm probably going to be moving on to a new game after this video, so look forward to that. But without further ado, let's jump into Dragon Age and talk about these numbers. So you can see here the peak, 89,000 as it was before. That was fairly close to launch day, and it's been going downhill since then. We're seeing new lows, lower highs, lower lows, as it goes on. Basically, last Sunday, the peak was 61,000. I don't think we'll ever see that again with this game. I think we're well on the road to zero at this point, and it's fallen off pretty quickly at this point because, I mean, you could see, even the lows last weekend, they were high 20s, low 30s, and now we're getting into, teens and probably under 10 in the next few days. We'll see what the weekend numbers do. They might rise a little bit, but by Monday, I think your lows are going to be under 10,000, and your highs are probably going to be under 30,000 consistently for that week. So yeah, we're well on the road to zero. Looking a little bit further down here, we can see the owner estimates are all over the place, which is kind of weird. Play Tracker is 197,000. Gamealytic and VG Insights are pretty close to each other, 600 and 642,000. I think that those are a little optimistic. I think Play Tracker is a little pessimistic. And I think the reason why is because I believe there was a lot of returns for this game, and their mechanism for determining these things is probably having a hard time figuring out how many returns versus how many purchases. That's just my guess. And my guess is just that Play Tracker was overly optimistic on the number of returns, and maybe Gamealytic and VG Insights were overly optimistic on the number of purchases. So they just kind of balanced out in that way. It does make sense, though, because if you kind of take the average or somewhere in the middle between that 200 and 600,000, putting it at like 350, 400,000, would make a lot of sense, because we had news of, Dragon Age had crossed the million copies sold threshold just this past week. So if they had just crossed a million copies, 350, 400,000 for Steam would make sense, because that would give you enough room within the consoles and the other stores, for what that's worth, to make sense in terms of sales proportionally across all platforms. So yeah, I think probably 350 to 400,000 is the right number. So that is that middle ground between those three estimates, as it has been, maybe a little lower than normal. But again, I think that that's probably due to the number of returns for this game. The number of people that jumped into Dragon Age and said, "Wow, this isn't a Dragon Age game," and refunded their money and noped out. That's probably got a lot to do with these estimates. The other thing I wanted to talk about real quick is the followers, basically the number of eyes on this game. And like you can see over a longer period of time, it's been growing and growing and growing. But since launch, it's kind of interesting, because it jumped up a little bit, but now it's leveling off. So we're getting to a point where, no people are adding this to their follow list. No people are really paying attention to it. So that kind of tells me that these numbers are going to start going down a lot faster, because you're getting no new traction in the follows. Usually that means that the play activity starts dropping off after a few days as well. So we're looking at, game over here. I mean, there's multiple things pointing to the fact that this game is dropping off a cliff. And honestly, it makes sense. Even BioWare is aware of it, because, I mean, they announced that, no DLCs are coming to Veilguard. This is it. They're done with this. They're fully on board with Mass Effect 5. And now, do I think that that's, I don't know, is that cope? Or is that like optimism? I mean, I am not optimistic that we're going to see a Mass Effect 5. Maybe they believe it, but I sure don't. But they're saying they're fully on board with Mass Effect 5, and that's where they're heading, and there's no DLCs planned for this. So that's it. It's done. Which does make sense. I mean, for what it's worth. I mean, and I hear a lot of people saying out there, "Oh, 1,000,000 copies. Boy, they did great. They did great. They didn't do great." Now, 1,000,000 copies for a AA game or an indie game would be fantastic. But we're not talking about a AA or an indie game here. We're talking about a game that purportedly had a $150 million development budget. And if the studio does what most studios do and spent equally as much, if not more, on marketing, then you're talking about a $300 million total budget that they have to pay for. Now, 1,000,000 copies is not going to make them $300 million unless they sold it for $300 a copy. And they didn't. They sold it for $60 a copy. So they'd need 5 million at minimum to break even. And that's being overly optimistic because that's assuming that no stores took a cut. That means that Steam didn't take their 30% and Xbox and PlayStation didn't take their 30%. Now, I do understand, being published by Electronic Arts, being BioWare, they've got a lot of ins with these companies, and certainly it's not going to be 30%, but it's also not going to be nothing. So even with my numbers, assuming nothing, they've gotten a fifth of the way to paying off the cost of this game. And that's, like I said, being very optimistic. So we're in a state. BioWare lost a lot of money on this. Electronic Arts is not going to be happy with the outcome of this thing. And I honestly think there could be some more layoffs in BioWare. There could be some more changes in store for that studio. Or, they might just shut it down altogether. I don't know. The sky's the limit in this day and age because we've seen studios that I wouldn't have expected to get shut down, but they got shut down. So, that's where we're at. So we'll see what happens. It is BioWare. I can't imagine them, trashing the whole studio. I can imagine some restructuring for sure, but we'll see what happens down the road. Now, getting to the reviews are very interesting. And, as it was before, mostly positive. 72% of the 20,000 user reviews for this game are positive. Now, if we get into the gory details here, and this is, these are the most helpful reviews in the past 7 days. I just refreshed this page today, so these are fairly recent. But if you kind of read through them, it gives you a clearer picture of what's going on here. And initially, I thought that there was some shady business going on with Steam, where they were floating these positive reviews or changing negative reviews to positives. But I don't think that's the case. I think this is actually reflective of Dragon Age and Dragon Age The Veilguard in general. So let's just read a few, and then you'll get a clearer picture of what I'm talking about here. This first one, this is barely a thumbs up since I don't feel I wasted my money. I enjoyed aspects of the game. As a standalone game, The Veilguard is fine. It gets better after the weak first act. As a Dragon Age game, it's the worst in the series. It would be easier if the game was just bad, but there are sparks of hope every now and then. I love the setting so much I wanted this to be a return to form. Most of the story design choices are baffling, if not downright insulting, and he just goes on. First off, the recommended should be turned into a recommended for new players and not recommended for DA fans. In general, DAV is a good RPG for people with zero knowledge about the existing lore in the franchise. The game has all the systems you'd come to expect from an RPG. It has a good skill tree. It has good combat design. It looks stunning. Has tons of QOL features, quality of life, and tons of customization. It's very well optimized and polished. Level design is awesome and precise. It doesn't suffer from open world emptiness and doesn't feel like much of a corridor simulator. Major quest levels are, it goes on. But effectively, he's saying it's a good RPG, but it isn't a Dragon Age game. I've never felt so conflicted over a single entry into the series as I do over this one. I only selected the thumbs up recommended option over the thumbs down because I feel like Dragon Age The Veilguard is a good game overall. It's just not a good Dragon Age game. And these just keep going. These are the positive reviews on this game. are basically saying, yeah, it's okay for an RPG, but it's not Dragon Age. And so I think what you're seeing here is people who had certain expectations about this game, and it seems like a lot of these are relating to Veilguard. Now, Veilguard was not a particularly well-received Dragon Age game, but clearly much better than this game was. And they had certain expectations from Veilguard, from the previous two Dragon Age games, I would say, Veilguard and or not Veilguard, Inquisition, and Dragon Age 2. I think because of those games, they have this idea in their head about what a Dragon Age game is, and obviously from the first game as well. And this did not meet it. This fell far short of it, even though it's a well-polished game, even though it is a very well-constructed game. It's not what they were expecting. And a lot of this is just, poor story design, because they did not make what a Dragon Age game should be. If this was just a normal RPG, it would have been fine. And even with the wokeness doesn't even factor in most of these reviews. Now it does show up once in a while where they say, I don't like the relationships. I don't like when you choose this. One review, it said, like, if you choose an attribute of ADHD, it's like stereotypical ADHD, and if you choose, I think it was non-binary, they force their non-binariness on the whole game, and nobody questions it or anything like that. And it's like, yeah, I mean, the people that made this game are pushing a political agenda, and they're pushing it over making a competent entry into the series of Dragon Age. And that's to say that, these are the writers, the designers of the story arc, not the developers. The developers, from what I can tell, did a very competent job. They made a very good RPG with tight mechanics and good combat and everything else. But the designers are the problem. The game designers are the issue here. And they would rather push their politics than pay attention to what a Dragon Age game should be and respect the lore. And that shows in these reviews. And yeah, it seems like, that's where these reviews came from. It makes perfect sense to me now that this is mostly positive, because it's a decent enough game. It's just not a decent enough game for the Dragon Age franchise, and they fell far short of that. And that's where these expectations were not being met. And that translates into these player counts. It translates into the fact that nobody's playing this thing at this point, and sales were abysmal for such an expensive game. So I don't know. The picture is getting a lot clearer for me, at least, that a mostly positive reviewed game is still an abysmal failure. And like I said, I mean, I guess to summarize, it's a combination of falling short of what a Dragon Age game should be, which is the designer's fault, in my opinion. And it's also the fact that it was so expensive to make. It was $150 million to make this game. To be perfectly honest, I think people could make this game on $7 million, not $150 million. And, a lot of the cost associated with this game, I think, is due to the complexity of AAA and the fact that they've loaded down with all these cutscenes. They've loaded down with all of these, these designers that really don't help your game. They actually hurt your game. Back in the day, there was no such thing as a lead designer. There was no such thing as a game designer. They didn't have those. They had like artists and coders, and the artists and the coders wore enough hats outside of that to make a competently architected plot and story. And that's why those games worked. It wasn't complicated, and people enjoyed it, and there was lore, and there was all these intricate details, but it didn't have to come from a dedicated role, because you had people that were passionate enough about the game to fill in those blanks and make it work between them all together. So Yeah, I don't think games need designers. I don't think games need writers. I think they need artists. I think they need, musicians and modelers and, 2D artists and developers. And between them all, you should be able to be passionate enough about the project to make a competent story. Now, I think you need someone to oversee it, someone to oversee the project, but they shouldn't have as big of a role as a designer does in the overall outcome of the game. I think giving people the opportunity to put their creativity to work in the work that they do will give you a much better outcome than this, because this is over specialization, and over specialization to a point where people that have entered that specialization don't care about the product that's being produced. They care about their politics mostly. They care about getting their paycheck and cashing in, but they don't actually care about the games anymore. And that's the problem. And that's the failure. And that's where we see something like Dragon Age The Veilguard come out and do abysmally and lose the studio money, lose the publisher money. And this is not going to be the last one. I hate to say it, but AAA is not learning from its mistakes. It seems to be doubling down, and so we're not going to see the end of this anytime soon. If they do come out with Mass Effect 5, Mass Effect 5 is going to be just as bad, if not worse. But that's the situation, and I guess that's why I push indie games. That's why I push AA games. I think indie and AA are where it's at. They're where you can find an interesting game, and there's no shortage of people pushing political agendas in indie games or AA. Mostly indie, though. I mean, indie is rife with them. I mean, they're all over the place. That said, though, there's enough games out there. There's enough of an open environment where people can make interesting and fun games that don't push political agendas over gameplay. And Mirthwood is a prime example of that. I mean, Mirthwood is what it is. It is a medieval survival farming RPG, and there's quests, and it's interesting, and it's not your super impressive Dragon Age graphics. It's not your 3D, perfect cutscenes and all that stuff. But it's a competent game, and it's interesting, and it keeps you entertained. And there you go, combat. Not that I'm any good at the combat yet, but you have combat, and it is somewhat challenging. It's all very timing based, and you have to get that right. And I don't know. That's what's missing, in my opinion, in AAA games. There's no skill involved in getting those games, getting to the ending of those games. It's all just going through the motions, and listening to basically a story unfold and just kind of having somewhat of an input in it while you kind of coast through it. And I don't know. It's just not a kind of game that I would enjoy. So, yeah, that's what I got for you guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. Like I said, I'll have the link in the description for Mirthwood if you want to check it out. And I will talk to you guys later.